All right, so this is my talk on the condensed history of lockpicking. So back in the day, locks were for wealthy folk, and often they wanted to show off that they were really wealthy and that they were rich enough to have stuff worth locking up. So often keys would be really massive, like this one, which is a medieval key, and it was 31 centimeters long. Justin Bieber has one just like it. So the Romans sometimes would put keys on their rings, and these were often for small trinket boxes. And for some wealthier women who could afford to have trinket boxes, this offered a small amount of agency for them because they could lock away things like love letters and jewelry and secret things, often away from their husbands as well. So in a time where, women weren't really, they didn't have any agency, that was like quite good. Here you can see one modeled by Mariah Carey. And here's an old Chinese lock with a very impractical key. This is selfie for scale. And people also had outrageously large key charms. So these were things that they would put symbols of, I don't know, stuff that they wanted, like fertility or money or whatever. And they would put these symbols on key charms. And this red one here was like about like this long, like they're massive, right? So with all these loud proclamations of security, you can probably imagine how to some scumbags, this was like a massive sign saying, hey, I've got stuff, and I bet you can't get it from me. The modern day equivalent is something like this. So modern day locks look something more like this, where you have, you line up the gap in the pins, and then the whole barrel will turn, which will turn the bolt. This design was developed by an American called Linus Yale Jr. in 1865. And the design, this design was really good because it was smaller and easier to mass produce. But this idea has been around for a long time, in fact. The earliest example found so far of the pin and tumbler lock, or the pin lock, was found in the palace of this guy, King Sargon II, in Khorzabad, or modern-day Iraq. So he ruled in about 700 BCE. And this is what the lock looked like. So you have this kind of weird toothbrush-shaped thing with a couple of pins there that you could push up. This design was also found in Egypt, so there will be some places that think that the pin locks were from Egypt, but it was actually from that guy. This kind of lock vanished for a while and then resurfaced in the 1800s, but we'll get back to that. So the security rating of a lock is typically measured in time, and this is because the longer a person is picking a lock means the greater opportunity that they have to be caught. So basically everything comes down to security through obscurity. So let's take a quick tour of some locks and some of the loop-de-loops and crazy things that people would do to try and deter people from picking locks. So this one here is an ornate watered lock, and sorry, it's a little bit hard to kind of see in this photo. Watered locks have strange shapes to try and like make it harder to stick typical lockpicking tools in there, but they're actually reasonably easy to bypass by bending some wire. Here's a close-up photo. So you can see that it's like fits very snugly in there. So this is another one that I quite like. This is called the Kicking Man Detector Lock. So here the keyhole is concealed by his leg, which is on a pivot, and when a button is pressed, the leg swings forward to show where the keyhole is. The door bolt is released by tilting the man's hat, and the man is holding a pointer against a dial, which is counting the number of times that the lock has been opened. So it doesn't necessarily stop people from getting in, but if you do get in, then the person who owns that lock will know. These two are definitely my favorites though. The lion lock on the right, that will clamp down on your hand if you if you pick it and you get it wrong. And this one here, you can't really see it, but it's got a pistol like right here, like this is the handle and that's the thing. So somebody would make a lock and then somebody would pick that and then somebody would make a better lock and somebody would pick that lock, and locks kept coming more and more sophisticated until we reached the era they called perfect security. So around the 1800s, lockpicking competitions became really popular. And they were kind of popping up all over the place. And one of the most famous events of this was this event. So this is a picture of the Great Exhibition held at the Crystal Palace. This is the name of the spiritual world where people would go and do math. This was this was a big deal because people from all over the world came. There were a bunch of famous people, including Charlotte Bronte, Lewis C. Carroll, George Eliot, Charles Darwin, Charles Dickens, and they all did math together at the Crystal Palace. Also at this event were two locks on display that people believed were impossible to pick. These were Brahma's lock and Chubb's detector lock. This is Brahma's lock. Brahma was so confident in his lock that he had a bounty on here for 200 guineas, which is the equivalent of $20,000 US in modern day times. And this was sitting in his shop window for 2 decades, waiting for people to pick it, sorry. This is a picture of the mechanism on the side. It's pretty hard to see though, so sorry about that. This is the Chubb's detector lock. If you lift the levers too high, then they'll get stuck. And the only way to get them unstuck is by calling or sending a message via horseback or whatever people did back then to call the locksmith, and he'd pull out a different key and he would rotate the lock in the opposite direction, which would reset all the pins. This one was also like pretty secure back in those days. I also realized while I was researching this talk that the Chubb's detector lock is based on this 5-pin / lever lock, which happens to be exactly like the lock at my parents' place. Please don't rob me. But that was quite interesting to discover. So now along comes this guy called Alfred Hobbs. Now, he walks into the Crystal Meth Palace with all the swagger of JC and mixes everything up. What he did is he worked for Day & Newell, a locksmithing company in the US. And what he used to do is he would go to potential clients and he would pick their locks and then show them how bad their security was and conveniently sell his own locks. So he was a bit of a sneaky salesman. So Brahma's challenge lock, the one that we first looked at, that his attempt required 51 hours over 16 days. And the Chubb's lock, the way that he picked that is he would deliberately trigger the tipping point of where the levers would get jammed, then he would reverse pick it to reset it and do that for each lever until he could find out where all the tricking points were, and that way he could unlock it. So it's brute forcing it essentially. So now that the era of perfect security is over, most people settle for pin and tumbler lock. As it turns out, lockpicking competitions weren't really that reflective of the public's needs. Like, they were really fun and everything, but the locks were really expensive and really intricate and hard to make. So it was great for hobbyists, but not so great for the general public. Turns out that any kind of lock is usually like good enough to deter most people, because usually down the street there's going to be somebody who just has their front door or whatever wide open. So here's a couple of mechanisms that people use to try and deter people. This lock here has this key here has a bunch of side pins, One of my work colleagues was showing me a lock that had like 36 pins in it, which, as you can imagine, would be quite difficult to pick. You can also have serrated pins where they've got little notches in the sides, so if they catch, then it's really hard to kind of like unstick them, and it just makes it take longer. And watered locks are still used, but they're kind of somewhat effective against your traditional lockpicking tools. But let's face it, it mostly comes down to trust. Like all security, the most effective attack is social engineering. So I'm going to leave with a story about Adam Worth. So he's the real life criminal that Dr. Moriarty was based on from Sherlock. He did a jewelry heist in South Africa by playing chess with his postmaster. And he played chess with this guy for 3 months and built this really great friendship. And then what he did is he started sending packages to himself, and he went in just at closing to pick those up. And this guy, this postmaster who trusted this person, just gave him the keys. So what he did is he promptly made some wax copies, and he happened to find some jewelry, which he stole from the safes, and he then ran away to London and sold the jewelry in his legit jewelry dealership. And the only way that we knew this was because he confessed on his deathbed to a detective. We wouldn't have known otherwise. So remember, the easiest way to open a lock is with the key. So thank you for listening.